Hello everybody, my name's Andre and welcome back to Med School EU. In today's video, we are going to talk about the immune system once again because the immune system is so complex and we're going to have to do two videos on it. So this is the second part. If you haven't watched the first part, please be sure to do that because in the first part, I talk about the cells of the immune system, which will be crucial to know for this part of the course. Now in part 2 of the immune system that we're going to talk about today, we will discuss primarily the innate and the adaptive immune system. So we're going to compare the two with a hypothetical example of what would happen and how would the body respond to an infection by bacteria or viruses or other pathogens. So let's begin. Now I'm going to go over this immune response in terms of a chronological order of what would happen and how the body would react in case of an infection. So the first thing that gets activated and the first responders are the innate immune system, and I discussed this briefly in the first video. However, in this one I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail. And just a disclaimer that for the IMAT course and in terms of just high school knowledge, you are not obligated to know most of these details that will be listed here, but I read a book recently on the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system and how they interchange, and I thought it was really fascinating, so I'm going to share that with you today, and I will be pointing out the parts that you do need to know for the IMAT exam. So starting off with the innate immune system, they are going to be the first responders. We talked about macrophages and neutrophils, so the response would be from phagocytes. And phagocytes are, of course, cells that do phagocytosis. The ones who we described in great detail in the first video were the macrophages and the neutrophils. So let's talk about those in more detail. Now, if we're talking about our scenario, here we've got a nail piercing through the skin, so these are the skin cells on the surface, and then because the nail, of course, it's got bacteria on it, it's got probably viruses on it, all kinds of pathogens, and once it pierces through the skin, it's going to, the bacteria are going to enter the body. And the first responders that are going to be macrophages and neutrophils, so these would be our neutrophils that are simply flowing underneath the skin. They are, remember that the neutrophils are pretty much patrol cells. They are there to, they're scavengers, they're patrolling around and they're looking for things to eat, things that are going to be harmful for the body, and they're able to identify that through glycoproteins. So they're going to look at healthy cells, and the glycoproteins will not correspond to what they should be attacking. However, the glycoproteins of the bacteria that are presented on the bacterial cells, they are going to be correspondent to the what the neutrophils are looking for. And as you can see here, the bacteria are just are eaten alive by these neutrophils. And of course the macrophages that will be around will join the fight as well. Now all of these little yellow dots that I have presented here, they would be typically much smaller than the bacteria, so this is not an accurate depiction of them. However, these molecules are going to be released by the healthy cells that were just killed due to the piercing of the nail, and they would release chemicals called histamine. Now many of you may know that histamine is an inflammatory chemical, so it promotes inflammation of that specific area. This is why we take antihistamine drugs when we have an allergic reaction or we have seasonal allergies. Typically you're given antihistamine drugs so that the histamine doesn't spread around the body and you don't have these reactions going on. However, when you do have danger, when cells are dying, all of these healthy cells have died because of the piercing of the nail inside the body. They are going to release the histamines. The histamines are basically going to sound an alarm. It's like an alarm is being brought up by these healthy cells that something's going on, there's a breach, and this needs to be fixed, this needs to be cleaned up. We need our fighters here to the front lines. And the fighters are neutrophils and macrophages. They are the first responders, as mentioned, and they are part of the innate immune system. So let's distinguish neutrophils and macrophages. We're going to begin with the macrophages that are considered to be the captains of the innate immune system because they tell other cells what to do. They tell the neutrophils to activate, and they activate other cells around them, and basically telling them what to do. They can increase or slow down the immune response at the battlefield to prevent further damage. So if this has all been cleaned up and the macrophages can sense that there's less histamine being released, and they can sense that the battle is being won because the bacteria are now being destroyed, then the macrophages will pause the immune response and they will slow it down. They will order the neutrophils to do apoptosis, so self-destruction. They're going to kill themselves in order to stop further damage, because when the neutrophils come in, they are these crazy warriors that are going to just wreak havoc on the battlefield, and they're going to destroy healthy cells, and they're going to destroy the harmful bacteria as well. So the macrophages are responsible for controlling how much innate immune response is happening. Now, the neutrophils are nothing special. They are just crazy suicidal warriors. Their only purpose is to float around, find bacteria, and eat the bacteria or pathogens or viruses or whatnot. And so when they are activated by the macrophages or by the histamines, they would go ahead and engulf several bacteria, and as soon as they reach their maximum, so they are exhausted from engulfing the bacteria, they would do apoptosis. They would kill themselves and form pus. We talked about this in the previous video. So there's some crazy numbers just to show you the scale of what's happening daily when a person is healthy. Is we have about 100 billion neutrophils that die on a daily basis, and we have 1 billion per kilogram of body mass that are born daily. So you can decide what that means for you, but as you can see, neutrophils rapidly die and they rapidly are born. Now, another thing to mention about the macrophages is that they are generally going around the body, and they're going to be patrolling. They're going to be eating dead cells, and when they are activated, they're also vicious fighters, just like the neutrophils. Their lifespan is longer than the neutrophil. However, they would still be depleted of energy, and as soon as they have used their maximum capacity of the innate immune response, then they would also perform apoptosis, and they would also do self-destruction. Now, these two cells, the neutrophil and the macrophages, are going to be involved in creating an inflammatory response, and that is something that we're going to talk about next. However, I just wanted to bring that up here because there's going to be multiple factors that cause inflammation in the body. One of them is the histamine molecule being released. So histamine is, of course, inflammatory chemical, going to cause inflammation. Then we got the neutrophils and the macrophages. If they see that the battle is not going in their favor, and of course there's a big mess, there's something big going on, then they're going to call for an inflammatory response, which is a universal response of the immune system to any threat or any damage, whether it's real or perceived. So a lot of the times when you have a perceived threat of a cut or a wound, there's going to be inflammation in that area because of the way our bodies work. Now, some of the symptoms of inflammation is pain, redness, swelling, heat, and loss of function. And the purpose of inflammatory response is to restrict infection to an area and stop the spread. So we're going to talk about what happens and what is an immune response in terms of the cellular level. Now, an important part to mention is that the inflammatory response is universal throughout the body, except in several areas where inflammation is very, very limited, and if not completely absent, because they're very delicate structures. So things like the brain, the spinal cord, parts of the eyes, and the testicles, if you happen to have those, they would exclude that area from inflammation, because inflammation is very damaging to the cells, and of course we cannot recover our nerve cells. So if the brain cells are going to die due to inflammation, then it cannot be recovered. Therefore, the inflammation there it exists, it happens in some places, but it is very, very mild compared to inflammation, for example, like on your skin. Let's talk about some factors that would promote inflammation and cause inflammation to happen within an area. And the first one is cells dying in unnatural ways. So what's incredible about the immune system is it's able to tell, and its cells are able to tell, if the healthy cells, the regular healthy cells, are dying a natural death from just being old, or they are dying unnaturally from damage or an infection. And so when they do die from damage or an infection, they release chemicals. Like I mentioned, histamine is the most prominent one that will cause inflammation to occur in the area. Now we also have mast cells that typically lie right underneath the skin, and they're found all over the body, and these mast cells release histamine and cytokines. So they also would release these yellow tiny little histamines, but they would also have cytokines. Now, because of the release of the histamines, the neutrophils and the macrophages coming along, and the mast cells releasing their cytokines, the blood vessels within the area are now going to dilate. They're going to increase the blood flow, and they're going to be more permeable. Now, what this means is that other cells, other white blood cells, so these are going to be white blood cells like other neutrophils, they are going to seep through the endothelium, and they're going to go onto the area in order to fight. Now what this also does is it increases the fluids in the tissues. So the tissue fluid, the volume of it, is now going to increase, and it basically just floods the area with a huge tsunami of extracellular fluid that seeps through from the blood. And that's why we get the swelling, we get the redness, we get the heat, because there's so much pressure being built up in the area. And it is very an uncomfortable environment for the pathogen, so the bacteria or the virus. It is uncomfortable, it's unnatural, and is very difficult to survive such an onslaught of an attack by the innate immune system. And that's why most of our cuts and most of our infections just end right there, because the neutrophils, the macrophages, and the inflammatory response is going to be able to combat this in a timely manner. However, if we do have an infection that is more serious, so the bacteria are able to combat the neutrophils and the macrophages, and maybe the neutrophils are not able to detect them, whatever happens to be, but it is a more serious infection, maybe the viral load is extremely high, that the innate immune system is not able to handle it. And so what happens then? The next thing that occurs, we got to talk about more cells of the immune response. And the cell that we're going to talk about is the dendritic cell. The dendritic cell is one of the connections that occurs between the innate and the adaptive response. So what the dendritic cell do is that it captures snapshots of the battlefield, and it takes parts of the enemy, so the bacteria or the glycoproteins of the bacteria, and it delivers it to the adaptive immune cells using the lymphatic system. And lymphatic system we haven't talked too much about yet, but we will discuss it in this video. Now the dendritic cell is quite fascinating, and there's so much detail in terms of how these things work, but I'm not going to get much into it since it's not part of our course. But I just wanted to create a connection between the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system, and that connection is typically done through the dendritic cell. The dendritic cell brings these snapshots of the battlefield to the T cells, and that's its job. And it finds these T cells within the lymph nodes or other organs like the spleen or the tonsils of the lymphatic system. And now we're going to discuss that in greater detail. But in general, you should know that the dendritic cell will leave the site of battle, and it's going to enter the lymphatic system, and it's going to circulate all around, continuously looking for the correct T cell that will match the pathogen's antigen. So it's going to have antigens of the pathogen, and the T cells are going to have antibodies, or the B cells will have its antibodies, and it's going to look for the right match within the lymphatic system. And once this happens, it basically just clicks and it activates the T cells to do their job, and that's how the adaptive immune response is activated in a nutshell. There's a lot more detail to it. There's so much physiology involved in it, but this is as far as we're going to go in terms of this course. So let's talk a little bit about lymphatic system. It is basically just a collection of these cities, which would be the lymph nodes, and these highways, that is the tubes that connect these lymph nodes, that go all around the body. And what's interesting about the lymphatic system is it's much slower. Of course, the lymph moves around much slower than the blood, because blood has a heart to pump things around. But how the lymphatic system moves is it's got these valves. As you can see, these valves are going to be contracting, and they're going to be pushing the fluid in the direction that it's supposed to go. Now, what's the purpose of the lymphatic system? Well, it is wide enough to allow proteins to be passed around. So the lymphatic system is spread all around the body. And as you can see here in the thoracic duct and lymphatic vessels from the villi of the small intestine, we talked about the villi and how they're composed and how they're able to collect all these macromolecules. Now, the fat and the large proteins are going to settle in the lymphatic vessels, and they're going to be carried all around the body until they reach the major veins. And some of those would be the subclavian vein. So it's going to dump its contents into the subclavian vein, which is wide enough to carry those large proteins. And as you can see, this is just a one-way valves, so the fluid can enter inside that is collected from the extracellular fluid. That fluid can go inside the lymph, and it becomes fluid called lymph, which is just exactly the same as the extracellular fluid, except it is in these compartments. And it's going to be able to carry the large proteins and the fat all around the body to the large veins, where then it could be circulated or used by the organs. Now we're going to talk about the adaptive immune response. So our T cells, which are part of the adaptive immunity, have been activated by the dendritic cell that traveled through the lymph. And now, of course, there's different kinds of T cells, and they do different things. But we're going to talk a little bit about the helper T cell, which is now going to be activated by the dendritic cell and is going to arrive at the site of injury. And so this is our helper T cell. And what this helper T cell does is it activates the phagocytes using cytokines. So it arrives at the site of injury, and it's basically going to make the macrophages and the neutrophils fight harder. It's going to give them this little touch, and it's going to basically command them to fight longer, fight harder, and kill more viciously. So it's going to promote doing more damage, more inflammation in the area. And it's not a specific response at this point. These antigens that are on the T cell, they're not going to be extremely specific to the pathogen that we have. They are going to be specific for it because the dendritic cell did find a close enough match, but they're not going to be 100% efficient. And we will discuss the other B cells that will produce antibodies that are extremely specific for the pathogen that we're fighting. But at this point, it's just a general response. So it's going to promote the phagocytes to fight harder using cytokines once again. And then there's going to be a large army of these antibodies that are going to arrive at the injury site as well as part of the adaptive immune response. And they're going to help the immune cells, so the neutrophils and the macrophages, to detect the enemies by being attached to them. They're basically going to be like markers, displaying this is the bacteria, this is the enemy, go and kill it. So antibodies have a role of just going all around the bacteria and attaching all around them, so it's easy for the neutrophils and the macrophages to find the enemies. We're going to go through a little bit of the labeling because this is something you should know for the IMAT test. You should know what the parts of the antibodies are and what they're responsible for. These long chains right here are going to be called heavy chains. They're heavy polypeptide chain. These are just proteins, but in general, these longer ones are going to be called heavy polypeptide chains. Now the tips here of the antibodies, these are going to be antigen binding sites. So this is where the bacteria would be binding to on the side of the antibodies. These smaller ones right here are going to be called light chains. Now, because the antigen binding sites are going to be different for pretty much every bacteria that the body is going to encounter, so the antibodies are going to be specific for the antigen that they are going to bind to. And antigens could be, there's millions of different varieties of antigen that could happen, and therefore these regions, the red ones I pointed out, they're going to be variable regions. And what that means is that they could be changed based on the demand of the antigen that they're binding to. So they could become specific to the antigen and bind very precisely. And another important aspect to point out here is these bonds that are right in the middle and the bonds here that connect the light and the heavy chains. These bonds are called disulfide bonds. And these disulfide bonds create something called a hinge region. Hinge region promotes flexibility for the antibody to open up further and to be able to attach to the antigen in a precise manner. Now there's several things that could happen once these things arrive at the battlefield. So if the battle is won, the helper T cells become memory T cells, and they are going to stop the immune response to prevent further damage, and then they're going to promote healing. But if further stimulation is needed, the T cells are going to activate B cells. So B cell activation leads to production of plasma cells. Now these are the plasma cells, and the purpose of plasma cells is to produce specialized antibodies. So these antibodies are specifically made for the pathogens, antigens that we have encountered. So it's specifically brought up, it's specifically made just to respond to that pathogen that we are fighting. And these antibodies are going to be way more efficient than the ones we've gotten at the beginning of the adaptive immune response because they're coming off the plasma cells that were originally B cells. And in the end, the B cells are then going to become memory B cells, and that is how typically the battle would be won. So I wanted to go over a quick summary of the innate and the adaptive immunity and their similarities and differences in terms of these 6 features. So the response speed of the innate immune system is going to be immediate. As we saw with the response speed of the nail cutting through, the innate immune system was right there immediately catching the bacteria that have entered. Now, in terms of the adaptive immunity, it's going to be prolonged. It's not going to be responsive right away. It's going to take several days to weeks. So again, talking about the kinetics, This is going to be a fast response within minutes to hours. It's going to produce swelling, inflammation, all of those symptoms. That's part of the innate immunity. However, production of specialized B cells and all of those things, they're going to take days to weeks. Now, the innate immunity is short-lived. Typically, we're going to have a short response of the innate immunity in terms of swelling and that immediate first responder effects. And adaptive immunity is going to be long, the duration, because it's going to produce these memory T cells and memory B cells, which will then be able to activate much sooner when a similar infection comes along for next time. For example, you caught the flu, you're probably not going to have the flu for another several years before your immunity is going to go away. So, for example, if you've had the flu or any other seasonal virus, you've had COVID, you're not going to catch COVID immediately again. Why is that? Because of the adaptive immunity that creates T cells and memory B cells that will then be able to respond to the same pathogen much quicker. And you will probably not even notice whether you had contact with the flu or you had contact with COVID, because you already have natural adaptive immunity that has produced those memory T cells and those memory B cells, and they are able to combat it without you experiencing any severe symptoms. Now, in terms of memory, innate immunity, of course, does not constitute memory. The adaptive immunity provides T cells, memory T cells, and memory B cells. Now, in terms of activity, the innate immunity is going to be always ready, but the adaptive immunity is normally silent, so it's going to be normally dormant until it is needed, until it is activated. And there's a reason why activation of the adaptive immunity takes this long, is because the body always wants to conserve energy, and of course the body does not want to cause more harm than good. We don't want our adaptive immunity to turn on because it causes lots of harm to the area, and it causes lots more inflammation than needed. Therefore, it is very difficult to activate adaptive immunity, and our body has made sure to only activate adaptive immunity when it is really needed, when the innate immunity cannot handle the task. And in terms of specificity, the innate immunity is unspecific, and adaptive immunity is highly specific. So this is the complete summary. This is something you should also know in terms of the IMAT exam. I would encourage you to memorize this chart so you know the difference between innate and adaptive immunity. So this concludes our lecture on the immune system. We're now done with the immune system, and we're going to move on to excretion.